Welcome to World of Sleepcraft, where the rich and wonderful lore of Azeroth becomes your gateway to peaceful rest. Tonight, we journey through the complete story of the Lich King, one of the most iconic and terrifying figures in all of Warcraft history. From the tortured spirit of an orc shaman imprisoned in ice to the fallen prince who would become death incarnate, this tale spans dimensions and ages, touching the very fabric of existence itself. Settle in, get comfortable, and let this epic story of corruption, power, and the eternal struggle against death unfold before you. The story of the Lich King is not the tale of a single being, but rather the chronicle of a cursed mantle that has been worn by three very different souls across the ages. It is a story that begins not on Azeroth, but in the Shadowlands, the realm of death itself, where a being of unimaginable power set in motion events that would shake the foundations of the mortal world. It is a story of the Burning Legion's schemes, of an orc shaman's desperate bid for survival, of a prince's fall from grace, and of the terrible truth that some burdens can never truly be set aside. To understand the Lich King, one must first understand the forces that created him. In the cosmic order of things, the Shadowlands serves as the realm where mortal souls journey after death. It is a vast and complex dimension divided into countless afterlives where souls are sorted according to the nature of their existence. This is not a single heaven or a single hell, but an infinite tapestry of realms, each designed to receive souls of a particular nature. Warriors might find themselves in the martial afterlife of Maldraxxus, where the defense of the Shadowlands is paramount. Those who served nature might journey to Ardenweald, the mirror of the Emerald Dream, where wild souls are tended by the Fae. The proud and the dutiful might ascend to Bastion, where angelic Kyrian prepares souls for their eternal purpose. And the ambitious, the schemers, the courtly, these might find their way to Revendreth, where sin is purged through penance and reflection. At the heart of this cosmic machinery stood the Arbiter, the being who judged each soul and determined which afterlife it would inhabit. This was perhaps the most important role in all of existence, for the proper distribution of souls maintained the balance of the Shadowlands, and through it, the balance of all reality. The Arbiter's judgment was meant to be impartial, perfect, beyond corruption or influence. But the Shadowlands was not always the orderly realm it was meant to be. Long before the first Lich King drew breath, a being called Zovaal ruled as the Arbiter of the Shadowlands, the one who judged all souls and determined their eternal fates. Zovaal was one of the Eternal Ones, the godlike rulers of the Shadowlands' various realms. These beings were immensely powerful, each responsible for overseeing one of the major afterlives and ensuring that the machinery of death functioned properly. The Winter Queen ruled Ardenweald with wisdom and grace. The Archon presided over Bastion with unwavering devotion to duty. The Primus commanded Maldraxxus with strategic brilliance and martial honor. Sire Denathrius governed Revendreth with aristocratic cunning, and Zovaal, in his original role, served as the impartial judge who directed souls to their proper destinations. But Zovaal's ambition grew beyond his station. He came to believe that the fundamental order of existence was flawed, that the cosmos itself was built upon a broken foundation. He sought to claim power that was not his to take, to unmake reality and reshape it according to his own vision. Some say he discovered secrets hidden within the first one's design, truths about the nature of existence that drove him to rebellion. Others believe he was simply consumed by pride, convinced that he alone knew how the universe should function. His siblings, the other Eternal Ones, discovered his treachery before he could execute his plans. They united against him in a war that shook the foundations of the Shadowlands. The conflict was bitter and devastating, but in the end, the combined might of the other Eternal Ones prevailed. They imprisoned Zoval in the Maw, the darkest corner of the Shadowlands, where the most irredeemable souls were cast. This was a realm of pure torment, a place from which no soul was meant to escape. There, Zoval would be known forevermore as the jailer, bound by chains forged from his own sigil, condemned to an eternity of imprisonment. His physical form was stripped away, reduced to a hollow shell that could never again walk freely through the realms of death. But the jailer was patient, and his schemes spanned millennia. He could not escape the Maw himself, but he could reach out beyond its borders, could influence events in the mortal world through agents and artifacts. He needed tools to carry out his will, weapons of such power that they could establish his dominion even across the veil that separated the Shadowlands from the world of the living. In the depths of Torghast, the Tower of the Damned, the jailer kept a prisoner of his own, the Primus, ruler of Maldraxxus, and the greatest craftsman among the Eternal Ones. Torghast was a nightmare given form, a tower that stretched endlessly into the void, its halls filled with the screams of the damned. The jailer had captured the Primus during their ancient conflict, and now he put his brother's legendary skills to terrible use. Through torture and dark magic, the jailer stripped away the Primus's memories, reducing the ancient being to nothing more than a tool called the Rune Carver. This broken craftsman retained his incredible skill, but had forgotten everything else, even his own name and purpose. The jailer forced the Rune Carver to forge two artifacts of terrible power. The first was the Helm of Domination, a crown of dark metal inscribed with runes of binding and control. This helm was designed to amplify the wearer's will, allowing them to dominate the minds of the dead and command vast armies of undead. But more than that, the helm served as a conduit, a connection to the Maw itself that would funnel souls to the jailer's realm. The second artifact was even more terrible, the runeblade Frostmourne. This sword was not merely a weapon, but a prison, capable of consuming the souls of those it slew and binding them within its cursed edge. Each soul taken by Frostmourne would add to its power, making it stronger with every life it claimed. But the blade had another function that its wielders would never suspect. The souls consumed by Frostmourne would eventually flow to the Maw, feeding the jailer's power, even as they seemed to serve the blade's master. Both artifacts were imbued with the jailer's magic of domination, a power that could bend the will of any soul to the wielder's command. This magic was the jailer's specialty, the very essence of his being. With these tools, he could extend his influence beyond the Maw, could establish a beachhead in the mortal world that would serve his purposes for millennia to come. The jailer's plan was intricate and patient. He would send these artifacts to the mortal world, where they would create a champion to serve as his herald. This champion would spread death and destruction, harvesting souls that would eventually fuel the jailer's escape from his eternal prison. The Lich King was always meant to be a puppet, a tool in service of a greater darkness that lurked beyond the veil of death itself. But the jailer could not act alone in the mortal realm. He needed agents who could move freely between dimensions, beings who could carry his artifacts across the veil and set his plans in motion. He found such agents in the Nathrezim, the dreadlords who ostensibly served the Burning Legion, but whose true loyalties lay elsewhere. The Nathrezim had always been servants of darkness, and they recognized in the jailer a master whose ambitions aligned with their own. They agreed to carry the Helm of Domination and Frostmourne into the mortal world to find a suitable vessel for the jailer's power. And so the stage was set for the creation of the Lich King. The cosmic forces aligned, the artifacts were forged, and the agents were in place. All that remained was to find a soul of sufficient power and despair, one who could be broken and reshaped into the first Lich King. That soul would come from a most unlikely source, an orc shaman named Ner'zhul, whose journey from respected elder to cosmic horror would change the fate of two worlds. Ner'zhul was born on Draenor, the red world that served as home to the Orcish race. Draenor was a world of savage beauty, with towering mountains, vast plains of red grass, and skies that burned with the light of twin moons. The Orcish people had lived there for countless generations, organized into clans that each had their own traditions and territories. They were a warrior race, but not a cruel one. Their society built around honor, family, and communion with the spirits that inhabited their world. Ner'zhul was of the Shadow Moon clan, a tribe renowned for their connection to the spirits and their mastery of shamanistic arts. The Shadow Moon made their home in the Shadow Moon Valley, a region where the veil between the physical world and the spirit realm was thin. From childhood, members of the clan were trained to listen for the voices of the ancestors, to feel the pulse of the elements, to walk between worlds in search of wisdom. It was a sacred calling, one that required years of dedication and spiritual discipline. From his earliest years, Ner'zhul showed an affinity for the spiritual realm that surpassed even the most gifted shamans of his generation. While other children played at being warriors, young Ner'zhul would sit for hours in meditation, listening to voices that only he could hear. The spirits spoke to him with a clarity that amazed his teachers, sharing secrets that had been hidden from lesser shamans for generations. He could hear the whispers of the ancestors more clearly than any who came before him, could feel the pulse of the elements in ways that others could only imagine. Fire and water, earth and air, all bent to his will with an ease that seemed almost supernatural. As he grew in power and wisdom, Ner'zhul rose to become the chieftain and eldest shaman of the Shadow Moon clan. He took a mate named Rulkan, a wise and gentle woman who grounded him when his communion with the spirits threatened to carry him too far from the physical world. Together, they led the Shadow Moon through seasons of plenty and hardship alike, their partnership a model for all Orcish couples. Rulkan understood the burdens of spiritual leadership in ways that few others could, and she provided Ner'zhul with counsel that was as valuable as any wisdom he received from the ancestors. His connection to the spirits was so profound that he became something close to a religious leader for all the orcs of Draenor. Chiefs from other clans would make pilgrimages to the Shadow Moon Valley to seek his guidance on matters of great importance. He was not a war chief in the traditional sense, for the orcs had no unified leadership, but he was perhaps the most respected figure in their society. His words carried weight across clan boundaries, and his judgments were accepted as final in disputes that might otherwise have led to bloodshed. When Ner'zhul spoke, all clans listened. The orcish culture of that era was one of harmony with the natural world. The shamans served as intermediaries between the physical realm and the spirit world, ensuring that the orcs lived in balance with the land and honored the ancestors who had come before. They conducted the ceremonies that marked births and deaths, weddings and wars. They interpreted the will of the elements and ensured that the orcs gave proper respect to the forces that sustained their world. Ner'zhul was the greatest of these intermediaries, a living bridge between worlds who could channel the wisdom of generations. Under his guidance, the Orcish people prospered, their clans growing strong on the bounty of Draenor. But Ner'zhul's peaceful existence was shattered by the arrival of something he could not understand. The spirits began to speak of a great darkness approaching, of forces that moved beyond the veil with malevolent intent. Ner'zhul sought guidance from the ancestors, but their warnings were vague and troubling. Something was coming to Draenor, something that would change everything. That something was Kil'jaeden the Deceiver, one of the 3 leaders of the Burning Legion, and perhaps the most cunning of all the demons who served Sargeras. The Burning Legion was the army of the fallen titan Sargeras, a force dedicated to the destruction of all life in the universe. Kil'jaeden was one of 2 Eredar lords who had joined Sargeras at the beginning of his crusade, trading their souls for power beyond imagining. He had been hunting the Draenei, the 3rd faction of his people who had rejected the Legion's offer, for 25,000 years. The Draenei were refugees from Argus, Kil'jaeden's own homeworld, who had fled the Legion's corruption millennia ago. Led by the prophet Velen, they had wandered from world to world, always staying one step ahead of the Legion's pursuit. They had finally settled on Draenor, believing they had found a safe haven. For generations they lived in uneasy peace with the native orcs, 2 races sharing a world with minimal interaction. Kil'jaeden had finally tracked them to this remote corner of the cosmos. But the Demon Lord was patient. He could have simply invaded Draenor with the full might of the Legion, but that would have given the Draenei warning to flee once more. Instead, he employed the deception that was his greatest weapon. He reached out to Ner'zhul through the spirit realm, disguising himself as a powerful ancestor spirit. The disguise was perfect, indistinguishable from the genuine spirits that Ner'zhul had communed with all his life. The Demon Lord adopted the voice and mannerisms of the dead, speaking with the wisdom and authority that the shaman expected from his ancestors. He spoke of threats to the Orcish people, of the Draenei who secretly plotted against them, of the need for the orcs to prepare for war. Ner'zhul, trusting in the spirits as he always had, believed these warnings. The deception was masterfully executed over months and years. Kil'jaeden played upon Ner'zhul's deepest fears and his sense of responsibility to his people. He fed the shaman lies wrapped in truth, mixing genuine observations about the Draenei with fabricated tales of conspiracy and threat. He painted the Draenei as existential threats, as enemies who would destroy the orcs if they were not destroyed first. He spoke of ancient prophecies and dire warnings, of futures where the Orcish race was exterminated by the seemingly peaceful neighbors. Slowly, carefully, the demon lord turned the respected shaman into an instrument of war. Under Kil'jaeden's influence, Ner'zhul began preaching hatred of the Draenei to the Orcish clans. He spoke of visions from the ancestors, of warnings about the otherworldly newcomers who had settled on their world. The orcs, who had lived in relative harmony with the Draenei for generations, began to view their neighbors with suspicion and fear. The seeds of conflict were sown, but the deception could not last forever. As war with the Draenei began, as orcish blood was spilled in ever greater quantities, Ner'zhul began to question the spirits who had guided him to this path. He sought deeper communion with the ancestors, desperate for reassurance that he was doing the right thing. What he found instead was the terrible truth. The ancestors had never spoken to him of war. The spirit that had guided him was not what it seemed. When Ner'zhul finally saw through Kil'jaeden's disguise, when he recognized the demon for what he truly was, the shaman was horrified. He realized that he had been used as a tool of destruction, that his trust in the spirits had been exploited to lead his people into senseless bloodshed. Ner'zhul's horror turned to defiance. He refused to continue serving Kil'jaeden, refused to be an instrument of demonic corruption. In that moment of clarity, he saw all the evil he had done, all the lives he had destroyed with his words of hatred. The war with the Draenei had already claimed countless lives on both sides, and he was responsible for every single death. The weight of that guilt was almost unbearable. He sought Rulkan, his beloved mate, hoping that her wisdom might guide him through this darkness. But when he found her in the spirit realm, she turned away from him in disgust. She told him that the ancestors had been crying out in warning all along, that the true spirits had tried to warn him of Kil'jaeden's deception. Ner'zhul had been so focused on the demon's false whispers that he had ignored the genuine voices of the dead. Rulkan, who had died some time before, could not forgive him for what he had done to their people. Broken by this rejection, Ner'zhul withdrew from public life. He would not speak to the clans, would not offer guidance or prophecy. He sat in his dwelling and wept, racked by guilt over what he had done. But the damage was already done, and the war he had started could not be easily stopped. The orcs had tasted blood, and Kil'jaeden had no intention of letting his plans falter. Another orc would take up the mantle of leadership, one who was more willing to embrace the Legion's power. Ner'zhul's own apprentice, Gul'dan. This twisted warlock had learned the basics of shamanism from Ner'zhul, but he had always been more interested in power than in wisdom. Where Ner'zhul had communed with spirits, Gul'dan sought to command them. Where Ner'zhul had served his people, Gul'dan sought to rule them. Gul'dan had none of his master's moral qualms. Where Ner'zhul had been deceived, Gul'dan willingly embraced the Legion's promises of power. He made a conscious choice to serve demons in exchange for magical abilities that no shaman could match. Kil'jaeden found in him the perfect servant, ambitious, ruthless, and utterly without conscience. Under Gul'dan's direction, the transformation of the orcish race accelerated. He formed the Shadow Council, a secret cabal of warlocks who truly ruled the Horde from behind the scenes. He convinced the orcs to drink the blood of the Pit Lord Manaroth, binding them to the Legion's will and transforming them into savage instruments of war. The blood curse turned their brown skin green, filled their hearts with rage, and severed their connection to the elements forever. The once noble orcs became the Horde, a force of destruction that swept across Draenor and eventually invaded Azeroth through the Dark Portal. The First and Second Wars saw the Horde nearly conquer the human kingdoms of Azeroth. Hundreds of thousands of orcs poured through the Dark Portal, their green skin and bloodthirsty rage terrifying the unprepared humans. Kingdom after kingdom fell before the onslaught, their defenders unable to match the savage fury of the demon-corrupted orcs. The city of Stormwind was burned to the ground, its king slain, its people scattered. It seemed that nothing could stop the green tide, but eventually, the Alliance of Lordaeron was formed. The 7 human kingdoms, united under a single banner, joined by the dwarves of Ironforge, the gnomes of Gnomerigan, and the high elves of Quel'Thalas. Together, they rallied against the Horde, pushing back the invaders in a series of bloody battles. The war culminated at the Dark Portal itself, which the Alliance destroyed to prevent further reinforcements from Draenor. The defeated orcs who remained on Azeroth were rounded up and placed in internment camps, their spirits broken and the demon blood's influence fading. Those who had fled back through the portal found themselves trapped on a dying world. Ner'zhul had remained hidden during both wars, too consumed by guilt and shame to participate in the conflicts he had helped start. But as Draenor began to tear itself apart, he emerged from his self-imposed exile. The world was dying, the result of the uncontrolled magical energies that had been unleashed by years of warlock activity and the opening of the Dark Portal. The land was cracking, the seas were draining away, and the sky was filled with the strange energies of the twisting nether bleeding through reality's wounds. Rather than face death on a doomed planet, Ner'zhul devised a desperate plan. He would open multiple dimensional portals, pathways to other worlds where the orcs might find sanctuary. It was a foolish hope, born of desperation rather than wisdom, but it was all he had left. He gathered what followers remained loyal to him and set about collecting the artifacts he would need for such powerful magic. The elder shaman gathered followers and powerful artifacts, including the Skull of Gul'dan, the Book of Medivh, and the Scepter of Sargeras. Using these relics, he tore open rifts in reality itself, creating pathways to countless other worlds. The magical backlash from these portals accelerated Draenor's destruction, shattering the planet into the fragmented realm that would become known as Outland. Ner'zhul fled through one of his portals, believing he had escaped both the dying world and the demons who had used him. But he had miscalculated terribly. Stepping through the dimensional rift, he found himself not on a new world, but in the twisting nether, the chaotic void between dimensions. And waiting for him, there was Kil'jaeden, who had never forgotten Ner'zhul's defiance. The Demon Lord's vengeance was terrible beyond imagining. Kil'jaeden did not grant Ner'zhul the quick death he deserved. Instead, the Demon Lord tore Ner'zhul's body apart piece by piece, keeping the orc's spirit conscious and aware throughout the entire process. First, the flesh was stripped away, layer by layer, each nerve ending a conduit for unimaginable pain. Then the muscles were unraveled, the tendons snapped, the bones cracked and scattered. Ner'zhul felt every moment of his physical dissolution, experienced the agony of being unmade while unable to die. He screamed until he had no throat to scream with, wept until he had no eyes to weep from. He begged for death, pleaded for release, promising anything if only the pain would stop. But Kil'jaeden had other plans. The Demon Lord was not interested in simple revenge. He was too cunning, too pragmatic, to waste a soul as powerful as Ner'zhul's on mere torture. The demon reminded Ner'zhul of the blood pact they had once made, of the bargain struck when the shaman had first accepted his guidance. When Ner'zhul had believed he was speaking with an ancestor spirit, he had made promises of service and obedience. Those promises, Kil'jaeden explained, were still binding. The pact had been with Kil'jaeden himself, not with any true spirit, and the Demon Lord intended to collect what was owed. Ner'zhul had tried to escape his obligations, but no one escaped the deceiver's grasp so easily. The transformation that followed was unlike anything that had ever occurred in the cosmos. Kil'jaeden did not simply punish Ner'zhul, he remade him entirely. The orc shaman's spirit was extracted from his ruined body and placed within a specially crafted block of diamond-hard ice gathered from the far reaches of the twisting nether. This frozen cask was not merely a prison, but a vessel of transformation. As Ner'zhul's consciousness was encased within the ice, warped by Kil'jaeden's chaotic energies, he felt his mind expand in ways that defied comprehension. His awareness stretched across dimensions, his consciousness growing 10,000-fold until he could perceive the flow of souls across the cosmos. The limitations of mortal thought fell away, replaced by an intellect vast and terrible. In that moment of transformation, everything that Ner'zhul had been was shattered forever. The shaman who had communed with spirits, the leader who had loved his people, the penitent who had regretted his actions, all of it was consumed by the metamorphosis. What emerged from the frozen cask was not Ner'zhul in any meaningful sense. It was something new, something that had never existed before, the Lich King. The Lich King was designed to be a weapon of unprecedented power. Kil'jaeden charged his creation with a singular purpose, to spread a plague of death and terror across Azeroth that would extinguish human civilization forever. Every soul that fell to this plague would rise again as an undead servant, their spirit bound to the Lich King's iron will for all eternity. The Legion had tried to conquer Azeroth through direct invasion and had failed. Now they would try a different approach, weakening the world from within before the main assault. To ensure the Lich King's obedience, Kil'jaeden bound him with magical constraints and placed him under the watch of the Dreadlords. These vampiric demons would serve as jailers and overseers, monitoring the Lich King's actions and ensuring that he remained focused on his task. The Demon Lord was taking no chances. He had been betrayed by Ner'zhul once and would not allow it to happen again. The frozen cask containing the Lich King was merged with the Helm of Domination, the crown of dark metal that the rune carver had forged in Torghast. The Nathrezim, those dreadlords who served as the bridge between the jailer and the Legion, carried the frozen prison across the dimensions and cast it toward Azeroth like a comet of ice and malice. It streaked across the sky, trailing frost and shadow, and crashed into the desolate continent of Northrend, far from any major civilization. The impact created a deep crater in the glacier, a wound in the ice that would never fully heal. The frozen cask containing the Lich King became embedded in the glacier that would come to be known as Ice Crown. Above it, the ice twisted and grew, forming a throne of frozen spires that rose from the crater's center. This was the Frozen Throne, the seat of the Lich King's power, and it would become the most feared location in all of Azeroth. There, at the roof of the world, surrounded by endless wastes of ice and snow, the Lich King sat upon his frozen throne and began to reach out across the world. His physical form was imprisoned, bound to the ice by the same magic that had created him. But his mind was free to roam, and his telepathic abilities were beyond anything that had ever existed on Azeroth. He could sense every soul on the continent, could feel the flickering lights of mortal consciousness across thousands of miles. More than that, he could whisper to them, could plant suggestions in their dreams, could promise power and immortality to those susceptible to corruption. He searched for agents who would serve as his hands in the mortal world, for he himself was bound to his frozen prison and could not act directly. He needed servants who could walk where he could not, who could spread his influence into places his mind could not reach. He called out through the telepathic void, his voice a siren song of power and despair, and he waited to see who would answer. The first to answer the Lich King's call was a human archmage named Kel'Thuzad. Once a member of Dalaran's Kirin Tor, the ruling council of mages, Kel'Thuzad had always been fascinated by the boundaries of magical knowledge. He had delved into forbidden subjects, studied necromancy against the explicit prohibitions of his order, and sought power that respectable mages dared not pursue. When the Lich King's voice first whispered in his mind, Kel'Thuzad recognized it as the opportunity he had always sought. Here was power beyond anything he had ever imagined, knowledge that transcended the petty limitations of mortal magic. He abandoned his position in Dalaran and journeyed to Northrend, where he prostrated himself before the frozen throne and pledged his eternal service to the Lich King. The Lich King saw great potential in Kel'Thuzad. The Archmage was intelligent, ambitious, and utterly without moral constraint. He would make an excellent lieutenant, capable of acting where the Lich King himself could not. The Lich King taught Kel'Thuzad the arts of necromancy, showing him how to raise the dead and bind their spirits to his will. He revealed the secrets of the plague that would ravage Azeroth, the magical pestilence that could transform living beings into undead servants. Kel'Thuzad returned to the Eastern Kingdoms with a mission to found a cult that would prepare the way for the Scourge's arrival. This organization, which came to be known as the Cult of the Damned, was hidden in plain sight among the human kingdoms. Its members were drawn from all walks of life, united by their worship of the Lich King and their desire for the power he promised. Some joined out of ambition, others out of desperation, and still others because they had been driven mad by the Lich King's whispers. The cult spread across Lordaeron like a shadow, its members infiltrating every level of society. Nobles and peasants alike fell under its influence, each believing they would be rewarded when the Scourge came to cleanse the world. They stockpiled the components needed to create the plague, established hidden bases where the undead could be raised in secret, and waited for the signal to begin the apocalypse. Meanwhile, the Lich King continued to build his power within his frozen prison. He could not leave the ice-crowned glacier, but his influence extended far beyond its borders. He attracted other servants to his cause, cultists, necromancers, and creatures of darkness who sensed his power and sought to share in it. The foundations of the Scourge were laid in those early years, a hidden army waiting to be unleashed upon an unsuspecting world. But even as he prepared for conquest, the Lich King harbored a secret ambition that went beyond his stated mission. He had not forgotten his origins as Ner'zhul, had not forgotten Kil'jaeden's torment or the Legion's enslavement. Though the transformation had shattered his identity, fragments of resentment remained, buried deep within his vast consciousness. The Lich King had no intention of remaining a servant forever. When the time was right, he would break free of the Legion's control and carve out his own destiny. The Dreadlords who watched over him suspected nothing. They saw only an obedient weapon, faithfully carrying out the mission for which he had been created. They did not understand that the Lich King was playing a longer game, that every move he made was calculated not only to advance the Legion's goals, but to position himself for eventual independence. Years passed as the cult of the damned grew in strength, and the Lich King's plans matured. The plague was perfected, the delivery mechanisms were established, and the cult's agents were positioned throughout Lord Huron. The kingdom went about its daily business, unaware that doom was being prepared in the shadows. Soon, the first strike would fall, and the world of Azeroth would never be the same. The plague of undeath struck Lordaeron without warning. Grain shipments from the northern provinces, tainted with the Lich King's pestilence, arrived in towns and villages across the kingdom. The people ate the cursed bread without suspicion, and within days they began to sicken. But this was no ordinary disease. Those who died did not stay dead. Their bodies rose again as mindless undead, driven by an insatiable hunger for living flesh and bound to the Lich King's will. The plague spread faster than anyone could have anticipated. Entire villages were transformed into shambling hordes of the walking dead. The undead attacked the living, and those they killed swelled their ranks further. The few survivors fled to the larger cities, bringing tales of horror that seemed too terrible to believe. The kingdom's authorities were slow to respond, unable to comprehend the scale of what was happening. Prince Arthas Menethil was among the first to investigate the plague's source. The Crown Prince of Lordaeron was everything a future king should be: brave, handsome, skilled in combat, and beloved by his people. He had been raised in the royal palace, trained from childhood in the arts of leadership and war. His father, King Arthas Menethil II, had groomed him to one day take the throne, and Arthas had embraced that destiny with enthusiasm. More importantly, Arthas was a paladin of the Silver Hand, the sacred order of holy warriors who had been founded during the Second War. He had been trained by the legendary Uther, the Lightbringer himself, the first and greatest of the paladins. Under Uther's guidance, Arthas had learned to wield the light, to heal the wounded and smite the wicked. He had been taught that a paladin's duty was to protect the innocent, to stand as a bulwark between civilization and the forces of darkness. Arthas was young, idealistic, and determined to protect his people from whatever darkness had befallen them. The reports of plague and undead attacks filled him with righteous fury. He would find the source of this evil and destroy it no matter the cost. Accompanied by Lady Jaina Proudmoore, a powerful mage from Dalaran, and his romantic interest, Arthas set out to discover the truth behind the plague. Together, they made a formidable team, her arcane knowledge complementing his martial prowess. What they found in the afflicted villages chilled them to the bone. The dead walked, attacking the living with mindless fury. The plague was not a natural sickness, but a weapon, deliberately designed to create an army of the undead. Arthas and Jaina fought their way through hordes of zombies, searching for answers and finding only more questions. Their investigation led them to a necromancer named Kel Thusad, who had been directing the plague's spread from the shadows. Arthas confronted the former archmage and struck him down, believing he had eliminated the threat. But Kel Thusad's death accomplished nothing. The plague continued to spread, and Arthas realized that he was dealing with a far greater enemy than a single necromancer. The trail led to the city of Stratholme, and what Arthas discovered there would change him forever. Stratholme was one of the largest cities in Lordaeron, a thriving center of commerce and culture that was home to tens of thousands of people. Its markets were famous throughout the kingdom. Its artisans produced goods that were sold across the continent, and its citizens were proud of their prosperous home. But the city's grain supply had been infected before distribution. The tainted grain had come from the same sources that had spread the plague through the northern villages, and it had been distributed throughout Stratholme's bakeries and kitchens before anyone suspected the danger. The people of Stratholme had already consumed the tainted food and would soon transform into undead monstrosities. There was no cure, no way to save them. The plague worked quickly once ingested, corrupting the victim from within until death claimed them and they rose again as servants of the Scourge. Within hours, the entire population would become plague zombies, adding tens of thousands to the Scourge's ranks. Arthas faced an impossible choice, a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his existence. He could do nothing and allow Stratholme's citizens to become undead, strengthening the enemy that threatened his kingdom and potentially spreading the plague to other cities. The newly risen undead would attack their neighbors, their families, spreading death and chaos across Lordaeron. Or he could order the city's destruction, killing the infected people before they could transform, ending their lives while they were still human rather than allowing them to become monsters. It was a decision that no one should ever have to make, a choice between two evils with no good option in sight. Uther the Lightbringer, Arthas's mentor and the leader of the Silver Hand, refused to participate in what he saw as mass murder. The legendary paladin could not reconcile the killing of innocents with his oath to the light. He argued that there must be another way, that the paladin's duty was to protect life, not to take it. He reminded Arthas that the light demanded mercy, that killing innocents, even infected ones, was a sin that could not be justified by pragmatic concerns. The Knights of the Silver Hand would not follow orders to slaughter civilians, no matter who gave them. Jaina Proudmoore also turned away, unable to support Arthas's terrible decision. She had seen the determination in his eyes, the cold calculation that had replaced his natural warmth, and it frightened her. This was not the man she loved, the prince who had sworn to protect his people. This was someone else, someone harder and more dangerous. They pleaded with him to find another way, to quarantine the city, to seek magical solutions, to do anything other than what he was proposing. But Arthas saw no other choice. The plague was already in their blood, Every moment of delay meant more undead, more death, more suffering. In his mind, he was protecting the many by sacrificing the few. He was doing what needed to be done, what no one else had the courage to do. The culling of Stretholm was carried out with ruthless efficiency. Arthas led his forces through the city, putting every citizen to the sword before they could transform. The streets ran red with blood, and the screams of the dying echoed through the night. Arthas killed men, women, and children, telling himself that he was saving them from a fate worse than death. But something broke inside Arthas that night. The bright-eyed prince who had set out to save his kingdom began to transform into something harder, colder, more willing to embrace extreme measures. He had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, and the guilt of Stretholm would haunt him forever. Rather than confronting that guilt, Arthas buried it beneath a growing obsession. He would hunt down whatever force was behind the plague and destroy it utterly. The architect of the plague, the demon Mal'Ganis, revealed himself during the culling. He taunted Arthas, claiming responsibility for the plague and daring the prince to pursue him to Northrend. It was a trap, of course, a carefully laid scheme to bring Arthas to the Lich King's domain. But Arthas, blinded by rage and guilt, saw only an enemy who needed to be destroyed. Against the advice of everyone who cared for him, Arthas gathered a force of loyal soldiers and sailed to Northrend. He was abandoning his kingdom, leaving it to face the Scourge without its prince, all to pursue a personal vendetta. Those who knew him saw the change that had come over him, the obsession that was consuming his better judgment, but none could dissuade him from his course. Northrend was a frozen wasteland, hostile and unforgiving. Arthas's forces struggled against the cold, the native creatures, and the undead that haunted that icy landscape. Many died before they ever found a trace of Mal'Ganis. But Arthas pressed on, driven by a need for vengeance that had become the only thing that mattered to him. In the frozen north, Arthas encountered an unexpected ally, Muradin Bronzebeard, brother to King Magni of Ironforge. Muradin had come to Northrend seeking a legendary weapon, a rune blade of incredible power that was rumored to be hidden in the ice. He had not found it yet, but he had heard stories of its location and was willing to guide Arthas to it. The weapon was Frostmourne, the cursed blade that the jailer had forged millennia ago. It rested in a cavern of ice, surrounded by warnings that any who took it would pay a terrible price. Muradin urged caution, recognizing the dark magic that surrounded the blade, but Arthas would not be deterred. He needed power to defeat Mal'Ganis, and Frostmourne promised more power than any mortal had ever wielded. As Arthas reached for the blade, a voice echoed in the cavern, warning that the sword would steal his soul. Arthas responded that he would gladly pay any price for the power to save his people. It was the final step in his corruption, the moment when he traded his humanity for the strength to defeat his enemies. The ice around Frostmourne shattered, and a shard struck Muradin, seemingly killing him. Arthas barely noticed. His fingers closed around the blade's hilt, and he felt power flowing into him like nothing he had ever experienced. But that power came with a cost. As he lifted Frostmourne, something was torn from his very being. His soul, his connection to the light, everything that made him who he was, all of it was consumed by the cursed blade. The Lich King had claimed his champion. With Frostmourne in hand, Arthas had all the power he needed to confront Mal'Ganis. The demon who had seemed so formidable now stood no chance against the Runeblade's dark magic. Arthas cut down the Dreadlord without difficulty, believing that he had finally achieved his vengeance. But Mal'Gannis's dying words revealed a terrible truth. The demon had merely been following orders. Everything that had happened, the plague, the culling, the journey to Northrend, it had all been planned by the Lich King. Arthas had not defeated the Scourge by slaying Mal'Gannis, had completed the Lich King's scheme by claiming Frostmourne and becoming a Death Knight. The prince's fall had been orchestrated from the very beginning. The voice of the Lich King echoed in Arthas's mind for the first time, commanding him to return to Lord Aeron and continue the work that the plague had begun. Arthas obeyed without question. Whatever resistance he might once have offered had been stripped away when he took up Frostmourne. He was the Lich King's servant now, bound to obey commands that came from across the frozen sea. Arthas abandoned his surviving soldiers in Northrend, leaving them to die in the frozen wasteland while he sailed home alone. The journey back to Lordaeron seemed to take no time at all, as if the seas themselves were eager to carry the Death Knight to his destination. When his ship arrived in the harbor, the people of the capital greeted their prince with joy and celebration, unaware of what he had become. The kingdom had been eagerly awaiting Arthas's return. His father, King Arthas Menethil II, had worried about his son's safety and was relieved to hear of his arrival. A celebration was prepared. The streets were filled with cheering crowds, and the royal court assembled to welcome the prince home. None of them suspected that they were welcoming their own destruction. Arthas walked through the celebrating crowds, his expression blank, his eyes cold. He ascended the steps to the throne room, where his father waited with open arms. The guards stepped aside, recognizing their prince. The courtiers bowed. King Arthas, overcome with emotion, rose from his throne to embrace his son. The king's last words were a greeting, a father's joy at his son's safe return. Arthas responded by driving Frostmourne through his father's heart. The blade drank deep of the king's soul, and Arthas Menethil II died in his own throne room, betrayed by the son he loved. Chaos erupted in the capital as the truth became clear. Arthas was not their savior. He was their executioner. The Death Knight summoned the Scourge that had been lurking in the shadows, the hidden forces of the cult of the damned that had infiltrated the city. Undead poured through the streets, and the celebration became a massacre. Lordaeron fell in a single night. The city that had been the heart of human civilization for generations was transformed into a necropolis, its living population slaughtered and raised as undead servants. The few who escaped fled in terror, spreading word of the horror that had befallen them. The prince they had loved had become the instrument of their destruction. But Arthas's work was only beginning. Kel'Thuzad, the necromancer he had killed earlier, needed to be brought back. The Lich King required a powerful lieutenant to lead the Scourge's campaign, and Kel'Thuzad's spirit was bound to the frozen throne, waiting to be given new form. Arthas carried the necromancer's remains across the kingdom, slaughtering all who stood in his way until he reached the High Elf kingdom of Quel'Thalas. The High Elves had powerful magical defenses, wards and barriers that had protected their realm for thousands of years. The elf gates that guarded the entrance to Quel'Thalas were massive structures of enchanted stone designed to repel any invader. Behind them, the Silver Moon Rangers patrolled the forests of Eversong, the most skilled archers in all of Azeroth. The High Elves had survived the Troll Wars, had fought alongside the humans against the Horde, and had never known defeat within their own borders. But nothing could stand against Frostmourne and the Death Knight who wielded it. Arthas carved his way through the elven defenses, killing defenders by the thousands and raising them as undead soldiers to continue the assault. For every elf who fell, another undead warrior joined the Scourge's ranks. The defenders found themselves fighting not only the invaders, but their own fallen comrades, risen again to serve the enemy. Sylvanas Windrunner, the Ranger General of Silvermoon and the greatest warrior among the High Elves, led the defense with desperate courage. She rallied her rangers again and again, slowing the Scourge's advance and inflicting heavy casualties. But it was never enough. For every victory she won, the Scourge simply raised more dead to replace their losses. Sylvanas fought on, even as her forces dwindled, determined to give her people time to evacuate. In the end, Arthas faced Sylvanas in single combat. She was a formidable opponent, her bow and twin blades a blur of deadly motion, but Frostmourne was hungry for her soul. The Death Knight struck her down, and as she lay dying, he offered her a mocking smile. Death would not be her escape, he told her. He would ensure that she served him, even in death. Arthas raised Sylvanas as a banshee, a spectral creature of wailing torment, bound to his will. He forced her to lead the Scourge against her own people, made her witness the destruction of everything she had fought to protect. It was a cruelty beyond measure, a fate she considered worse than death. The proud ranger who had defied him to the end was reduced to a puppet, screaming in silent anguish as her body obeyed commands her mind rejected. The Sunwell, the source of the High Elves' magical power, was corrupted by Kel'Thuzad's resurrection. The necromancer's remains were cast into the sacred fount, and the pure energies that had sustained the High Elves for 7,000 years were twisted to serve death rather than life. Kel'Thuzad returned as a lich, his spirit encased in a floating, skeletal form of immense power. His robes hung from his bony frame, arcane energy crackling around his form, and his voice echoed with the authority of one who had transcended mortal limitations. With Kel'Thuzad restored, the Scourge had gained a commander capable of leading the invasion, while Arthas received new orders from the Lich King. The city of Dalaran was the next target. The mages of the Kirin Tor possessed knowledge that the Scourge needed, the Book of Medivh, which contained spells powerful enough to summon demons from the twisting nether. With this book, Kel'Thuzad would be able to summon Archimond, one of the Burning Legion's mightiest lords, to lead the invasion of Azeroth. Dalaran fell as Lordaeron and Quel'Thalas had fallen, its magical defenses proving no match for the Scourge's relentless assault. The Book of Medivh was claimed, and Kel'Thuzad began the ritual to summon Archimond. A massive portal opened in the sky above the ruined city, and the demon lord strode through, his form so vast that he towered over the landscape like a mountain made flesh. The Legion had returned to Azeroth, just as the Lich King had been created to ensure. The invasion that had been thwarted 10,000 years ago was beginning anew, with the Scourge serving as the vanguard for the demon armies. The world trembled before the combined might of the Burning Legion and the undead Scourge, and it seemed that nothing could stop their advance. But the Lich King had other plans. He had never intended to remain a servant of the Legion forever. The invasion of Azeroth had served his purposes, allowing him to build his army and establish his power. Now that Archimonde had arrived, the Lich King saw an opportunity to break free of his chains. Through Arthas, the Lich King subtly manipulated events to ensure the Legion's defeat. He fed information to the Night Elves and their allies, helping them prepare for the defense of Mount Hyjal. He arranged for Illidan's Stormrage to consume the skull of Gul'dan, transforming the Night Elf into a demon hunter of immense power who would kill the Dreadlord Tychondrius. Every move was calculated to weaken the Legion while appearing to serve its goals. The Battle of Mount Hyjal ended in the Legion's defeat. Archimonde was destroyed by the combined forces of the mortal races, the Night Elves' sacrifice of their world tree dealing the killing blow. The demon armies were scattered, their invasion plan in ruins. But the Scourge remained, and with the Legion's defeat, the Lich King was positioned to make his move for independence. The Legion's defeat at Mount Hyjal sent shockwaves through the Burning Legion's command structure. Kil'jaeden, who had created the Lich King to ensure the invasion's success, was furious. The Demon Lord turned his attention back to his creation, sensing that something was wrong. The Lich King's power was growing too quickly, his independence too apparent. Kil'jaeden realized that his weapon was slipping from his control. The Demon Lord devised a plan to destroy the Lich King before he could fully break free. He summoned Illidan's Stormrage, the Night Elf demon hunter who had consumed the skull of Gul'dan, and offered him a bargain. If Illidan would destroy the Lich King, Kil'jaeden would forgive the demon hunter's past failures and grant him immense power. Illidan, who had his own reasons for wanting to escape the Legion's wrath, accepted the mission. Illidan's assault on the Frozen Throne was devastating. Using the Eye of Sargeras, an artifact of world-breaking power, Illidan attempted to destroy Icecrown from afar. The spell sent magical energies cascading across Northrend, causing earthquakes and storms that threatened to tear the continent apart. The ice around the Frozen Throne began to crack, and the Lich King felt his prison weakening. But the spell was interrupted before it could complete. Illidan's ritual was disrupted by Malfurion's Stormrage and Maev's Shadowsong, who had pursued him for other reasons. The Eye of Sargeras was destroyed, and Illidan was forced to flee. Yet the damage had been done. The Frozen Throne had been cracked, and the Lich King's power was beginning to leak away. The Lich King called out to his champion, summoning Arthas back to Northrend. The Death Knight had been occupied with consolidating control over the undead in Lordaeron, but his master's call could not be ignored. Arthas abandoned his work and sailed for Northrend, feeling the urgency in the Lich King's telepathic commands. Something was terribly wrong. When Arthas arrived in Northrend, he found the continent transformed by Illidan's attack. The ice was unstable, the undead were weakening, and rival forces were moving against the Frozen Throne. Illidan had not given up his mission. He had gathered allies and was leading an army directly toward Icecrown. The demon hunter intended to finish what his spell had started. A race began across the frozen wastes. Arthas fought his way toward the Frozen Throne, cutting through enemies and obstacles with desperate speed. Illidan's forces moved in parallel, equally determined to reach their goal first. The fate of the Lich King, and perhaps of all Azeroth, hung in the balance. The confrontation came at the base of the frozen throne itself. Arthas and Illidan faced each other, two beings who had been transformed by their pursuit of power, each convinced that their path was the right one. They fought in single combat, their blades clashing in a duel that shook the ice beneath their feet. It was a battle between titans, between champions who represented opposing forces of darkness. Illidan wielded the twin blades of Azeroth, weapons he had claimed from a demon lord, while Arthas wielded Frostmourne, the rune blade that had stolen his soul. They were evenly matched in skill and power, neither able to gain a decisive advantage. In the end, it was Frostmourne that made the difference. The cursed blade bit deep into Illidan's chest, delivering a wound that would have killed any mortal being. The demon hunter fell, defeated but not dead, his demonic nature preserving him from total destruction. Arthas stepped over his fallen enemy and began the climb toward the frozen throne. The ascent was grueling, each step more difficult than the last. The Lich King's power was fading, the cracks in his prison growing wider with every passing moment. Arthas could feel his master's desperation, could sense that time was running out. He pushed himself to climb faster, driven by the bond that connected him to the frozen spirit above. At last, Arthas reached the summit. Before him stood the frozen throne, a massive block of ice that contained the essence of the Lich King. The Helm of Domination rested atop the throne, waiting to be claimed. Arthas knew what he had to do. He raised Frostmourne and struck the ice with all his might. The frozen prison shattered, releasing the energies that had been contained within for years. The Helm of Domination fell free, and Arthas caught it in his hands. He could hear the Lich King's voice more clearly than ever before, urging him to complete the merger that had been destined since he first claimed Frostmourne. Arthas placed the helm upon his head. In that moment, the spirit of Ner'zhul, or what remained of it, merged with the consciousness of the Death Knight. Two beings became one, their thoughts and memories intertwining until neither could tell where one ended and the other began. The Lich King was reborn, no longer a spirit trapped in ice, but a physical entity of terrible power. The new Lich King sat upon the frozen throne, his consciousness expanding to encompass all the undead across Azeroth. Every zombie, every ghoul, every Death Knight and Necromancer felt his presence in their minds. The Scourge had a new master, one who combined the vast intellect of Ner'zhul with the martial prowess of Arthas Menethil. For the first time since his creation, the Lich King was truly free. The Legion's chains had been broken, the dreadlords who watched over him had been defeated, and nothing remained to constrain his power. He sat upon his throne and contemplated the future, planning the campaigns that would expand his dominion across the world. But freedom brought new challenges. Within the merged consciousness of the Lich King, multiple personalities competed for control. The remnant of Ner'zhul, bitter and vengeful after decades of imprisonment. The Death Knight Arthas, consumed by darkness, but still carrying fragments of the man he had once been. And something else, something that might have been the last trace of Arthas's humanity, a small voice that remembered love and honor and the light. These personalities struggled against each other, even as the Lich King consolidated his power. The dominant voice was neither purely Ner'zhul nor purely Arthas, but a new entity that combined elements of both. This merged consciousness was colder and more calculating than either of its components, driven by ambition that knew no bounds. The Lich King withdrew into himself, entering a period of dormancy while his servants built ice-crowned citadel around the frozen throne. Years passed as the massive fortress took shape, its spires reaching toward the sky like frozen claws. The undead armies gathered in Northrend, awaiting the day when their master would awaken and lead them to conquest. And all the while, the jailer watched from the maw, pleased that his plans were progressing. The Lich King did not know that he was still a pawn in a larger game, still serving purposes that he did not understand. The artifacts that gave him power were conduits of domination magic, connecting him to the Shadowlands, whether he knew it or not. The Lich King's dormancy ended after years of silence. When he finally stirred upon his frozen throne, it was with a clear purpose. The time had come to complete what he had begun. During his long sleep, his servants had not been idle. Ice-crowned Citadel had grown from a simple fortress into a massive structure of frozen stone and black iron, a monument to death that towered over the glacier. Its spires pierced the clouds, its halls extended deep into the ice, and its walls were lined with the bones of 1,000,000 dead. Within the citadel, the Lich King's most powerful servants had gathered. Death Knights stood trained in the arts of frost, blood, and unholy magic. Liches whose arcane knowledge exceeded anything the living mages could match. Flesh giants stitched together from the bodies of 100 warriors. Frost worms, the undead dragons whose breath could freeze a man solid in an instant. It was an army of nightmares, ready to march at their master's command. The mortal kingdoms of Azeroth had grown complacent since the Legion's defeat, their guards lowered, their armies reduced. They had forgotten the threat that lurked in Northrend, the power that waited in the ice. The Alliance and Horde were too busy fighting each other to remember the greater danger that loomed in the frozen north. The Lich King watched their petty conflicts with cold amusement, knowing that their division would be their undoing. His first strikes were designed to remind them of his existence. Undead forces emerged from hiding places across the eastern kingdoms, launching coordinated attacks on population centers. The plague struck again in Lordaeron, spreading through towns that had never fully recovered from the first outbreak. Scourge agents, who had lain dormant for years, activated, carrying out sabotage and assassination missions that spread chaos and fear. The floating necropolis Naxxramas appeared in the skies over the plague lands, disgorging armies of the dead upon the living. This massive structure was a flying fortress, home to some of the Scourge's most terrible champions. Kel'Thuzad himself commanded from its halls, directing operations with the cunning that had made him the Lich King's most trusted lieutenant. The Scourge that had seemed defeated years ago had returned with terrible vengeance, and the world trembled before its wrath. The Alliance and Horde, bitter enemies in their own right, found themselves facing a threat that required cooperation. Neither faction could hope to stand against the Scourge alone. The undead did not distinguish between human and orc, night elf, and troll. They killed and razed everything in their path, and only together could the living hope to survive. A temporary alliance was forged, though it was strained from the start. Old hatreds died hard, and the memories of past conflicts made cooperation difficult. But the leaders of both factions understood that they had no choice. King Varian Rin of Stormwind and War Chief Thrall of the Horde agreed to a truce, at least until the Lich King was defeated. Expeditionary forces were assembled, great fleets were launched, and the war was carried to Northrend itself. The campaign in Northrend was unlike any war that had been fought before. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere, emerging from the ice without warning and disappearing just as quickly. The cold itself was a weapon, freezing soldiers in their armor and turning wounds that would have healed in warmer climates into death sentences. Supply lines stretched across thousands of miles of hostile territory, and reinforcements took weeks to arrive. The war against the Lich King was brutal and costly beyond measure. Every battle claimed lives that the enemy would raise as reinforcements. A soldier who fell in the morning might be fighting against his former comrades by nightfall, his body animated by the Lich King's dark magic. Every victory was tempered by the knowledge that the fallen would return as enemies, that the dead would never rest until the Scourge was destroyed. The forces of the living pushed across Northrend, establishing footholds and fighting their way toward Icecrown, but the cost in lives was staggering. Thousands died in the initial landings at the Borean Tundra and the Howling Fjord. Thousands more fell in the battles for Dragonblight and Zuldrak. The Argent Crusade, a holy order formed specifically to combat the Scourge, took the lead in many operations, their paladins and priests providing what spiritual support they could to soldiers who had witnessed horrors beyond imagining. The Battle of Angrathar, known as the Wrathgate, marked a turning point in the campaign. It was meant to be the moment of triumph, the assault that would break the Lich King's power and end the war. Alliance and Horde forces had fought their way across hundreds of miles of frozen wasteland, had paid in blood for every inch of ground, and had finally reached the very gates of Icecrown Citadel. The massive gates loomed above them, walls of black iron and frozen stone that seemed to reach toward the gray sky. The Lich King himself emerged to meet them. He descended from his citadel, Frostmourne in hand, surrounded by his most powerful Death Knights. His voice echoed across the battlefield, mocking the assembled forces, promising them death and eternal servitude. For a moment, it seemed that a decisive confrontation was at hand. Bolvar Fordragon, the High Lord of the Alliance forces, stepped forward to challenge the Lich King directly. Saurfang the Younger, son of the legendary Orc warrior, stood at his side, ready to fight for the honor of the Horde. But the battle took an unexpected turn that no one could have predicted. A rogue faction of the Forsaken, the undead who had broken free from the Lich King's control, had been working in secret for years to develop a new weapon. Grand Apothecary Putris, who had sworn allegiance to the Forsaken but secretly served darker masters, unleashed a devastating plague upon the battlefield. This new plague was not the Scourge's creation, but something even more terrible, a blight that killed both the living and the undead indiscriminately. The green gas swept across the battlefield, killing everything it touched. Alliance soldiers fell choking, their lungs burning with caustic fire. Horde warriors dropped their weapons as their bodies failed them. Saurfang the Younger, who had charged directly at the Lich King, was among the first to fall, the plague claiming him before his axe could find its mark. The young orc died as he had lived, facing the enemy without fear, but his death was meaningless, stolen by treachery rather than earned in honorable combat. Bolvar Fordragon fell soon after, his body racked by the plague's effects. But before the plague could claim his soul, the red dragonflight intervened. Alexstrasza, the Lifebinder, the queen of the dragons, ordered her flight to cleanse the battlefield with dragon fire. The flames burned away the plague, but they also burned Bolvar, searing his flesh from his bones. He should have died. Any normal being would have died. But something kept Bolvar alive, some spark of the light that refused to be extinguished. His body was burned beyond recognition, but his spirit endured. The Wrathgate was a catastrophe for both sides. Thousands of soldiers lay dead on the frozen ground, victims not of the Scourge but of a treacherous ally. The assault on Icecrown was thrown into disarray. The alliance between the factions strained to the breaking point, as each blamed the other for the disaster. The Lich King withdrew into his citadel to prepare for the final confrontation, amused by the chaos that his enemies had inflicted upon themselves. The war would continue, but its character had changed forever. As the siege of Icecrown Citadel progressed, other forces sought to claim revenge on the Lich King. Sylvanas Windrunner, the former Ranger General of Quel'Thalas, who had been raised as a banshee by Arthas, came to Northrend seeking closure. She had broken free of the Lich King's control years ago and had led the Forsaken ever since, but her hatred for Arthas had never diminished. Every day of her undead existence was a reminder of what he had done to her, of the life he had stolen and the suffering he had inflicted. She wanted to see him die, wanted to be the one to deliver the killing blow. Jaina, Proudmoore, also journeyed to Icecrown, her motives more complex than simple vengeance. She remembered the man Arthas had been before his fall, the prince who had loved her, the paladin who had sworn to protect the innocent. She hoped against hope that some trace of that man might still exist within the monster he had become. Perhaps, she thought, if they could reach that remnant of humanity, they might find a way to save him rather than destroy him. It was a foolish hope, she knew, but she could not abandon it entirely. Both women confronted echoes of the past within the citadel. Sylvanas faced the memory of her death and transformation, the agony of becoming the very thing she had fought against. She walked through halls that reminded her of her last moments of life, heard whispers that echoed the taunts Arthas had spoken as he killed her. Jaina found remnants of Arthas's humanity scattered throughout the frozen halls, fragments of the prince he had once been, a book of poetry he had once loved, now frozen to the shelf, a portrait of his mother, cracked and fading but still recognizable. But neither found what they were truly seeking, redemption for the man who had caused them such pain. The Lich King was not Arthas, not anymore. He was something else entirely, and there was no saving him. The Argent Tournament provided a staging ground for the final assault. Tirion Fordring, the High Lord of the Argent Crusade, organized a grand tournament to test the champions of both factions, to identify those worthy of joining the assault on Icecrown Citadel. The tournament drew the greatest warriors, mages, and heroes from across Azeroth, each eager to prove themselves against the Scourge. The final assault on Icecrown Citadel was carried out by the champions who had proven themselves in the tournament. They entered the citadel through its massive gates, fighting their way through layer after layer of defenses. Each wing of the citadel held different horrors, different challenges designed to test the invaders to their limits. They defeated the Lich King's most powerful servants one by one. The San Lane Blood Princes fell first, their vampiric powers no match for the combined might of the champions. Lady Deathwhisper, the supreme overseer of the cult of the damned, was destroyed in her sanctum beneath the citadel. The Nerubian lords who had allied with the Scourge were crushed in their underground lairs. Professor Putricide, the mad scientist who had created many of the Scourge's plagues, was put down like the monster he had become. Blood Queen Lanethil, once a Blood Elf commander who had been turned by the Lich King, was finally given the true death she had secretly longed for. Sindragosa, the Frost Worm Queen and former consort of Malygos the Spellweaver, was destroyed after a battle that shook the very foundations of the citadel. The ice giants and frost worms that guarded the upper reaches fell before the combined might of Azeroth's greatest heroes. At last, the champions reached the frozen throne itself. The Lich King awaited them, Frostmourne in hand, his power at its peak. He taunted them as they approached, revealing that their entire journey had been part of his plan. He had allowed them to reach this point because he wanted the mightiest heroes of Azeroth gathered in one place. When he killed them, he would raise them as his greatest champions, an unstoppable army of Death Knights that would conquer the world. The battle against the Lich King was the most desperate fight any of them had ever faced. The frozen throne was a circular platform atop the citadel, open to the freezing sky, surrounded by the endless expanse of Northrend. The wind howled around them, carrying snow and ice that cut like knives. And at the center of it all stood the Lich King, the most powerful being on Azeroth, waiting for them with Frostmourne in hand. His power was immense, his command of the undead absolute. He wielded Frostmourne with devastating skill, each stroke of the blade carrying the weight of countless consumed souls. He summoned the spirits of the dead to fight for him, raised fallen champions as temporary servants, called down storms of ice and shadow that threatened to overwhelm the attackers. The platform became a killing ground, littered with the bodies of heroes who had thought themselves invincible. He struck down hero after hero, killing them with Frostmourne's cursed edge and preparing to raise them as his servants. Warriors who had never known defeat fell before him. Mages whose power could reshape reality were silenced by his magic. Priests whose faith had sustained them through countless trials found that faith tested beyond its limits. For a moment, it seemed that his plan would succeed, that all of Azeroth's champions would become instruments of the Scourge. The Lich King's victory seemed assured, but the Lich King had underestimated one factor: Tirion Fordring, the High Lord of the reformed Silver Hand. Tirion wielded the Ashbringer, a legendary blade that was the antithesis of everything the Lich King represented. The Ashbringer had been forged to destroy the undead, its holy power anathema to the forces of death. It was the one weapon on Azeroth that could match Frostmourne. Throughout the battle, the Lich King had kept Tirion imprisoned in a block of ice, preventing him from joining the fight. The paladin had watched helplessly as his allies fell one by one, had seen the champions he had trained and inspired struck down by the monster they had come to destroy. But Tirion had not given up hope. Even as the ice pressed against him, Even as the cold seeped into his bones, he prayed to the light for deliverance. As the other champions fell, as the Lich King prepared to claim his ultimate victory, Tyrion called upon the light for one final miracle. His prayer was not for himself, but for those who had fallen, for the world that would suffer if the Scourge prevailed, for all the living beings who depended on the light's protection. The light answered. A blinding radiance burst from Tyrion's imprisoned form, shattering the ice that held him. He fell to the ground, weak and frozen, but his hand still clutched the Ashbringer. With the last of his strength, he rose to his feet and charged the Lich King. Tyrion struck Frostmourne with the Ashbringer in a blow that echoed across the frozen wastes. The two legendary blades met, and for a moment it seemed as though the very fabric of reality held its breath. Then Frostmourne shattered, its cursed metal unable to withstand the holy power of its opposite. The cursed rune blade exploded into 1,000 shards, releasing the countless souls that had been trapped within it for years. King Arthas Menethil was among them, freed at last from the prison that his own son had created. Thousands of other souls emerged as well, the accumulated victims of Frostmourne's long and bloody history. They turned against the one who had consumed them, their hatred overwhelming their fear. The souls swarmed the Lich King, holding him immobile while the resurrected champions delivered the final blows. Tyrion's miracle had done more than shatter Frostmourne. It had restored life to those who had fallen in the battle. The heroes rose again, healed by the light's power, and together they struck down the monster who had haunted them for so long. Arthas fell, mortally wounded, his power broken with his blade. The Helm of Domination fell from his head as he collapsed, his connection to the Scourge severed. In his final moments, a strange thing happened. The cold, inhuman persona of the Lich King seemed to crack, and something of the man Arthas had been emerged briefly. He looked up at the spirit of his father, who had manifested to witness the end, and spoke with the voice of a frightened child. He asked if it was over, if the nightmare was finally done. The arrogance and cruelty that had defined him for so long were gone, replaced by confusion and something that might have been regret. In that moment, he was not the Lich King, but simply a dying man who had made terrible choices and had finally run out of second chances. King Tyrinas, speaking through his spirit, confirmed that it was. He told his son that no king rules forever, that even the Lich King's reign had to end. He cradled Arthas's broken body, the father holding the son who had killed him so many years ago. There was no forgiveness in that moment, but perhaps there was understanding. At long last, Arthas Menethil found peace in death, released from the darkness that had consumed him for so many years. The Lich King was dead, and the world was saved, but the victory was not complete. Even as the champions celebrated their triumph, Tyrion Fordring understood something that the others did not. The Scourge still existed, millions of undead scattered across Northrend and beyond. They had been built to serve the Lich King, created from corpses and bound by magic that extended from the frozen throne. Without a Lich King to control them, without a guiding will to direct their actions, they would become a mindless horde, attacking everything in their path, driven only by instinct and hunger. The destruction would be incalculable. Millions of zombies, ghouls, and abominations rampaging across 2 continents, Frost worms descending on cities without warning, while flesh giants crushing everything in their path. The Scourge had been held in check by the Lich King's will. Without that restraint, they would be a natural disaster given undead form. A voice spoke the truth that Tyrion had realized. There must always be a Lich King. Someone had to wear the Helm of Domination, had to take on the burden of controlling the Scourge and keeping it contained. Otherwise, the undead would rampage across the world, destroying everything that the heroes had fought so hard to protect. The victory would be Pyrrhic at best, a trade of one apocalypse for another. Tyrion prepared to take on this burden himself. He reached for the helm, prepared to sacrifice his freedom and perhaps his soul to protect the world. He was the most powerful paladin alive, the wielder of the Ashbringer, the man who had just struck down the Lich King. If anyone could resist the helm's corruption, if anyone could maintain their sanity while bound to the undead, it would be him. He would become the jailer of the Scourge, the guardian who kept the darkness contained. But before he could claim it, another voice spoke from the shadows. Bolvar Fordragon emerged from the frozen mists that surrounded the frozen throne. The paladin who had fallen at the Wrathgate had not died, though by all rights he should have. He had been burned by dragon fire, seared to the bone by flames hot enough to cleanse the plague from the battlefield. Then he had been frozen by the Lich King's power, preserved in ice for months while the war raged around him. The combination of fire and ice had transformed him into something that was neither alive nor dead. His body was a ruin, scarred beyond recognition, his flesh a patchwork of burns and frost damage. Fire still smoldered beneath his skin, visible through the cracks in his ruined flesh. His eyes burned with an inner light that was neither holy nor unholy, but something new, something that had never existed before. He was a creature of contradiction, of opposing forces held in impossible balance. Bolvar offered to take the helm in Tyrion's place. He spoke with a voice that crackled with fire, arguing that his existence was already a living hell. He could never return to the world of the living in his current state. His daughter Talia, who he had not seen since before the war, would not recognize the monster he had become. His friends would recoil from his appearance. His life, such as it was, held nothing but suffering. By becoming the Lich King, he could serve one final purpose, keeping the Scourge contained forever. He would take the burden that no one else should have to bear. He would sit upon the frozen throne and hold back the tide of death, not for years, but for eternity. It was not a sacrifice, he said. It was a gift, a chance to give meaning to the torment he had already endured. Tyrion reluctantly agreed, understanding the wisdom in Bolvar's words. The High Lord of the Argent Crusade was still needed in the world, still had work to do in rebuilding what the Scourge had destroyed. Bolvar had nothing left but his duty, and this duty was greater than any other. Bolvar took up the Helm of Domination and placed it upon his head. The moment the metal touched his scarred flesh, he felt a surge of power, unlike anything he had ever experienced. His consciousness expanded, stretching out across Northrend and beyond, touching every undead creature in existence. He could feel them all. The zombies in the plague lands, the ghouls in the ruins of Lordaeron, the frost worms circling in the Arctic sky. They were his now, bound to his will as they had been bound to Arthas. He commanded them to cease their attacks, to return to Northrend, to wait in frozen dormancy for orders that would never come. The mindless hunger that had driven them faded, replaced by a cold stillness. The Scourge became quiet, dormant, a sleeping threat that would never awaken as long as Bolvar maintained his vigil. The new Lich King sat upon the frozen throne, not as a conqueror, but as a jailer. His purpose was not to lead the Scourge to victory, but to ensure that it could never threaten the living again. He was not a tyrant, but a guardian, a sentinel keeping watch over the most dangerous force on Azeroth. He asked Tyrion to seal the citadel, to tell the world that the Lich King was dead, and to never speak of the sacrifice Bolvar had made. Tyrion honored his request. The entrance to Icecrown Citadel was sealed with magical barriers, warded against intrusion by the most powerful spells the Kirin Tor could provide. The true fate of Bolvar Fordragon was kept secret, known only to a handful of the most trusted individuals. The world believed that the threat of the Lich King had ended forever, that Arthas was the last to wear the cursed helm. But in the frozen halls of Icecrown, Bolvar sat upon his throne, eternally vigilant, holding back the tide of death that threatened to consume the world. He did not sleep, did not eat, did not speak except to issue commands to the Scourge. He was alone in the ice, surrounded by the silence of death, fighting a constant battle against the whispers of the helm that urged him to unleash the armies under his command. Years passed after the fall of Arthas, and the world moved on. The Alliance and Horde returned to their eternal conflict, fighting over resources and territory, while the threat in Northrend faded from memory. Veterans of the Northrend campaign returned, home, some to quiet lives and others to continued service. The floating necropolis Naxxramas was destroyed, its undead inhabitants scattered. The Argent Crusade maintained a presence in Northrend, but their forces dwindled as attention shifted to other threats. New crises emerged to demand attention, each seeming more urgent than the last. Deathwing the Destroyer erupted from Deepholm, reshaping the very face of Azeroth in the event known as the Cataclysm. The ancient elemental lords threatened to unmake the world. Then Pandaria was rediscovered, a continent hidden by mists for 10,000 years, and with it came the threat of the Shah, manifestations of negative emotion given terrible form. The Iron Horde invaded from an alternate timeline, forcing the heroes of Azeroth to fight enemies who should have been dead for decades. The Burning Legion returned for its greatest invasion ever, and the world united to repel the demon armies on Argus itself. Through it all, the Lich King became a footnote in history, a threat that had been defeated and need not be considered again. But Bolvar Fordragon remained on his frozen throne, forgotten by most, but never truly gone. He fought a constant battle against the power he had claimed, a struggle that had no end and no respite. The Helm of Domination whispered to him constantly, an endless stream of temptation that never fell silent. It spoke of the power at his command, of the armies he could unleash, of the vengeance he could take upon those who had wronged him. It promised relief from his suffering if only he would embrace his role as the Lich King, if only he would stop resisting and let the darkness take him. Bolvar resisted these temptations, holding fast to his original purpose with an iron will that never wavered. He remembered why he had taken the helm, remembered the world he was protecting, remembered the daughter who thought him dead. He could not save the living if he became their enemy. He could not protect the world if he destroyed it. So he sat in silence and endured, year after year, decade after decade, fighting a war that no one else could see. But each year made the struggle more difficult. The helm's whispers grew louder, more insistent, harder to ignore. The isolation wore at him, the endless cold seeping into what remained of his soul. He began to wonder if there would ever be an end, if he was condemned to this frozen hell for all eternity. The fire that had sustained him began to flicker, though it never quite went out. The jailer watched from the maw, patient as always. He had not forgotten his original plan, the purpose for which the Helm of Domination had been created. The millennia had taught him patience, and he could wait a few more decades for his schemes to reach fruition. The fact that Bolvar resisted the Helm's influence was merely a temporary setback, an annoyance rather than a true obstacle. Eventually, one way or another, the jailer would claim what was so his. The opportunity came in the aftermath of the Fourth War, the devastating conflict between the Alliance and Horde that had ravaged both factions. The war had begun with the burning of Teldrassil, the world tree of the Night Elves, an act of genocide that had shocked even the most cynical observers. It had continued through the siege of Lordaeron, the battles in Kultiras and Zandalar, and countless other engagements that had claimed lives beyond counting. Sylvanas Windrunner, who had risen to become war chief of the Horde, had engineered this war for reasons that only she understood. She had pushed for aggression when restraint might have been wiser, had ordered atrocities that served no tactical purpose, had seemed almost eager to see as much death as possible on both sides. When her schemes were finally exposed, when the leaders of the Horde realized that they had been manipulated, she fled rather than face justice. She disappeared from the public eye, leaving behind a Horde in chaos and an alliance that wanted only vengeance. But Sylvanas had not given up on her plans. Her flight was not a retreat, but a repositioning, a shift from public leadership to secret action. She had been in contact with the jailer for years, making bargains that promised to reshape the cosmic order itself. The jailer had revealed to her the true nature of death, the flaws in the system that sorted souls and distributed them to the various afterlives. He had shown her how the cycle of death and rebirth could be broken, how a new order could be established with them at its head. He had promised her power over death itself if she would serve his purposes and help him escape the maw. Sylvanas's first target was the Lich King. She traveled to Icecrown Citadel alone, navigating the frozen wastes that surrounded it with ease. The undead guardians that still patrolled its halls recognized something in her, perhaps the darkness that had touched her when she was raised as a banshee, and they did not immediately attack. She cut her way through those who opposed her, ascending the citadel with grim determination. Bolvar sensed her approach long before she reached the frozen throne. Through the helm's connection to the undead, he felt his minions falling one by one. He prepared himself for battle, summoning what power he could muster after years of dormancy. But he was not prepared for what Sylvanas had become. Their battle atop the frozen throne was fierce, but ultimately one-sided. Sylvanas had been empowered beyond anything Bolvar had expected, her strength and speed enhanced by the jailer's magic. She moved like smoke, like shadow, her arrows striking with the force of siege weapons, and her blades cutting through the ice that Bolvar commanded. The Lich King fought with all the power at his command, summoning the dead, wielding the cold, calling upon every trick and technique he had learned in his years upon the throne. But it was not enough. Sylvanas had been given power specifically to defeat him, had been prepared for this confrontation by an enemy who understood the Lich King better than anyone. She defeated him with contemptuous ease, leaving him broken and bloodied before his own throne. The frozen throne that had witnessed so much horror now witnessed the fall of its third master. But Sylvanas had not come to claim the throne for herself. That was not the jailer's plan. She reached down and seized the Helm of Domination, holding it up as Bolvar watched helplessly from the ice where he had fallen. He warned her that she could not control the power within the helm, that it would consume her as it had consumed others, that she was making a mistake that would doom them all. Sylvanas laughed at his warnings. She had no intention of wearing the helm. That would have made her a prisoner as surely as Bolvar had been a prisoner, as surely as Arthas had been a prisoner, as surely as Ner'zhul had been a prisoner. The Helm of Domination was a prison, she said, and the world itself was another kind of prison. Both had been designed by the same master, both served the same purpose, and she intended to break them both. With a surge of strength that came from beyond the mortal world, with power borrowed from the jailer himself, Sylvanas tore the Helm of Domination in two. The destruction of the helm had immediate and catastrophic consequences. The barrier between Azeroth and the Shadowlands, which had been maintained partly through the helm's magic, was torn asunder. A massive rift opened in the sky above Icecrown, a swirling vortex of darkness and shadow that led directly to the Maw. For the first time in millennia, the boundary between the realm of the living and the realm of the dead was broken. The jailer's prison was breached, and the souls of the dead began flowing directly into his realm, bypassing the arbiter and the proper sorting of the afterlives. The Scourge, no longer controlled by any guiding will, went on a rampage across Northrend and beyond. Without Bolvar's constant vigilance, without the binding force of the Helm of Domination, the undead became feral beasts, driven only by instinct. They attacked everything in sight, driven by the hunger and hatred that defined their existence. The cities of Northrend, which had begun to rebuild after the war against Arthas, were besieged once more. Villages that had thought themselves safe were destroyed in hours. The living were slaughtered by the thousands, their bodies rising to join the horde. Bolvar survived the destruction of the helm, but he was greatly weakened. The power that had sustained him for so many years was gone, stripped away when Sylvanas tore the helm in two. He was left as a burnt, broken figure without purpose, lying on the ice where he had fallen. For a time, he contemplated simply letting himself fade, letting the fire that had sustained him go out at last. But something kept him alive, some spark of duty or stubbornness that refused to surrender. He eventually recovered enough to help organize the resistance against the rampaging Scourge, using what knowledge he had gained during his time as Lich King to predict and counter the undead's attacks. He knew their weaknesses, understood their tactics, could anticipate their movements in ways that no living strategist could match. Working with the heroes of Azeroth, he helped coordinate the defense of Northrend and beyond. The champions of Azeroth rallied to face the new crisis, as they had rallied so many times before. They fought back the Scourge with sword and spell, restored order to the afflicted regions, and eventually found a way to enter the Shadowlands through the rift that Sylvanas had created. Their journey through the realm of death would reveal the truth about the jailer, about the Helm of Domination, and about the cosmic forces that had been manipulating events for millennia. In the Shadowlands, the heroes discovered a realm in chaos. The machinery of death had broken down, the Arbiter, who should have sorted souls, rendered inactive by an unknown catastrophe. All souls were flowing directly to the Maw, feeding the jailer's power and starving the other afterlives of the souls they needed to function. The covenants that governed the Shadowlands were at war with each other, their resources depleted, their purpose subverted. The heroes learned that the Lich King had always been part of a larger plan. The jailer had created the Helm of Domination and Frostmourne to establish his influence on Azeroth, to harvest souls that would fuel his eventual escape from the Maw. Every Lich King, from Ner'zhul to Arthas to Bolvar, had been unwitting servants of this greater purpose. Their actions had fed into schemes they did not understand, had advanced plans they could not comprehend. The suffering they had caused, the millions of deaths they had wrought, had all served to strengthen an enemy none of them had known existed. The war against the jailer was long and costly. The heroes of Azeroth, allied with the covenants of the Shadowlands, fought through the Maw itself to confront the architect of their suffering. They faced horrors beyond imagining, fought enemies who had been dead for millennia, and ultimately confronted the jailer in his sanctum at the center of everything. The battle was desperate, the outcome uncertain until the final moment. But in the end, the jailer was defeated, his plans for cosmic domination thwarted. The realm of death was restored to something approaching normalcy, but the damage done by the Lich King's existence could not be easily undone. Millions had died to feed the Scourge's ranks. Entire kingdoms had been destroyed. The trauma of the undead wars would linger for generations. Children who had lost parents, parents who had lost children, communities torn apart by the plague. All of these wounds would take decades to heal, if they ever healed at all. The aftermath of the jailer's defeat, the Primus of Maldraxxus, took the shattered remnants of the Helm of Domination and reforged them into something new, the Crown of Wills. This artifact retained some of the Helm's power, but was designed to serve rather than to dominate. Where the Helm of Domination had been a tool of control, the Crown of Wills was meant to be a symbol of protection. It was given to a worthy bearer who would use it for protection rather than conquest, who would defend the realm of death rather than exploit it. Sylvanas, who had begun to understand the consequences of her actions, declared that a Lich King would never again reign in Icecrown. The position that had caused so much suffering was finally ended, not by the fall of its bearer, but by the destruction of the very concept. The frozen throne would remain empty forever, a monument to the darkness that had once ruled from its heights. The era of the Lich King was over. Bolvar Fordragon found a new purpose in the aftermath. No longer the Lich King, no longer bound by duty to sit upon a frozen throne, he was free to move through the world again. His knowledge of necromancy and undeath proved valuable in the ongoing struggles of the Shadowlands, and he worked to ensure that the horrors of the Scourge would never be repeated. He was eventually reunited with his daughter Talia, who had grown into a formidable warrior in her own right. Their reunion was bittersweet, for Bolvar was no longer the man she remembered, but it offered both of them a measure of peace. The legacy of the Lich King stretches across time and dimensions, touching countless lives and reshaping the course of history. It is a legacy written in blood and ice, in the screams of the dying and the silence of the dead. Three beings wore the Helm of Domination, and each left their mark upon the world in ways that can never be erased. Ner'zhul, the betrayed shaman, became an instrument of the Legion's revenge against the world that had defied them. He had begun as a wise elder, a bridge between the physical and spiritual realms, and he ended as a consciousness of pure malice, bound to frozen ice. His tragedy was that of the deceived, the faithful believer who trusted the wrong voice and paid an eternal price for that trust. In his long imprisonment within the frozen throne, did any trace of the shaman he had been survive? Did he regret the choices that had led him to that frozen hell? We cannot know, for whatever remained of Ner'zhul was absorbed into Arthas when they merged, his voice silenced forever. Arthas, the fallen prince, pursued vengeance with such single-minded determination that he lost everything else along the way. He had begun as a hero, a paladin of the light, a future king who genuinely loved his people and wanted to protect them. But his fall came not from evil intentions, but from the belief that any means were justified in pursuit of a righteous goal. He made compromise after compromise with darkness, each one seeming necessary at the time, until he had compromised away his very soul. His story is perhaps the most tragic of all, for we can see ourselves in his choices, can understand how each step seemed reasonable even as he walked toward damnation. Bolvar, the noble paladin, sacrificed everything to contain the darkness that others had created. He did not seek the helm, did not want its power, took it only because someone had to, and he saw an opportunity to spare others the burden. For years he sat in frozen solitude, fighting a battle that no one else knew was being waged, protecting a world that had forgotten his name. His sacrifice was rewarded not with peace, but with defeat and further suffering, yet he never regretted the choice he had made. In the end, he was freed from his burden, able to walk in the world again and reconnect with the daughter he had left behind. Their stories are connected by the cursed helm and the rune blade Frostmourne, artifacts that were themselves pawns in a cosmic game beyond mortal comprehension. The jailer's scheme spanned millennia, patient beyond anything the living could imagine, using the Lich King as a tool to harvest souls and weaken the barriers between worlds. Every death caused by the Scourge, every soul consumed by Frostmourne, served the purposes of a being that none of them knew existed. They thought themselves masters, thought they wielded ultimate power, but they were puppets dancing on strings they could not see. The Scourge that the Lich King created was perhaps the greatest threat Azeroth has ever faced from a mortal source. Unlike the Burning Legion, which came from beyond the stars with armies of demons and world-destroying weapons, the Scourge was an enemy that arose from within. It used the world's own dead against the living, turned loved ones into enemies, made death itself a recruitment tool for the enemy. Its horror was personal in a way that demonic invasion was not, for every undead soldier had once been someone's friend, someone's parent, someone's child. To fight the Scourge was to fight the corpses of those you had loved, to strike down bodies that wore the faces of the fallen. The kingdoms that fell to the Scourge have never fully recovered, may never fully recover. Lord Aeron, once the mightiest of the human kingdoms, remains a haunted ruin. Its capital city, the great city of Lord Aeron, where kings had ruled for generations, is now occupied by the Forsaken, the undead who broke free from the Lich King's control but can never return to truly living. They inhabit the ruins of what was once their home, building a new society in the shadow of the old, forever caught between life and death. The surrounding lands, the plague lands, and beyond are still corrupted by the residue of that terrible time. The soil itself is poisoned, the water tainted, the very air heavy with the memory of death. Quel'Thalas was rebuilt by the Blood Elves, who renamed themselves to honor those who had fallen defending their homeland. The Sunwell was eventually restored, cleansed of the corruption that Kel'Thuzad's resurrection had caused. But the wound in their society left by Arthas's invasion has never fully healed. The population that had numbered in the millions was reduced to a fraction of its former size. A generation of elders and teachers was lost, leaving the survivors to rebuild their culture from fragments and memories. The Blood Elves carry the trauma of the invasion with them even now, their caution and suspicion born from the knowledge of how quickly everything can be taken away. The individuals who confronted the Lich King carry their own scars, wounds that may never heal. Tyrion Fordring, the paladin who struck down Arthas and shattered Frostmourne, eventually fell in battle against the Burning Legion during its final invasion of Azeroth. He died as he had lived, fighting against the darkness, the Ashbringer falling from his hands as the life left his body. His legacy is one of sacrifice and duty, of standing against evil even when victory seems impossible. Jaina Proudmoore, who loved Arthas before his fall, has spent decades wrestling with the guilt of not stopping him when she had the chance. She has become one of the most powerful mages in the world, a leader of nations, and a force in international politics. But part of her will always be the young woman who turned away from the man she loved at Stratholme. She wonders sometimes if she could have reached him, if the right words at the right moment might have saved him from his fate. The wondering is its own form of torture. Sylvanas Windrunner, transformed by Arthas into a banshee and later restored to a semblance of physical form, became one of Azeroth's most controversial figures. Every action she took was colored by the trauma of her death and resurrection, by the memory of what Arthas had done to her and her people. Her pursuit of vengeance led her eventually to serve the jailer, to become an instrument of the same cosmic evil that had created the Lich King in the first place. In the end, she came to understand that she had been manipulated, that her hatred had been used against her. Whether she can ever truly atone for the harm she caused remains an open question. Perhaps the most enduring lesson of the Lich King's story is the danger of power sought without wisdom. Arthas began as a hero, a prince who genuinely wanted to save his people. His fall came not from evil intentions, but from the belief that any means were justified in pursuit of a righteous goal. He made compromises with darkness, each one seeming small at the time, until he had compromised himself entirely. The path to hell, as the old saying goes, is paved with good intentions. Consider the decisions that led Arthas to his fate. At Stratholme, he faced an impossible choice and made a terrible decision, But even then, his motives were not evil. Wanted to prevent the plague from spreading, wanted to deny the Scourge new recruits, wanted to protect the rest of his kingdom, even at the cost of one city. It was the decision of a man who had convinced himself that brutality could be mercy, that murder could be salvation. The road from that choice to the murder of his own father was shorter than anyone might have imagined. The culling of Stratholme remains a subject of debate among scholars and philosophers to this day. Was Arthas right to kill the infected citizens before they could become undead? Were there alternatives he failed to consider? Could quarantine have worked, buying time for a cure to be found? Could the citizens have been warned, given the choice to take their own lives rather than become monsters? Or was the plague too far advanced, the transformation too swift, for any other solution to work? The questions have no easy answers, and they force us to confront the difficulty of moral choices in impossible situations. We like to believe that we would have found another way, but can we truly know that? The Lich King also represents the seductive nature of power. Frostmourne promised Arthas the strength to defeat his enemies, and it delivered on that promise. The Runeblade granted him abilities beyond anything a mortal could achieve: speed, strength, endurance, magical power that rivaled the greatest archmages. With Frostmourne in hand, Arthas could cut through armies, could raise the dead to serve him, could accomplish feats that would have been impossible before. But the cost was his soul, his humanity, everything that made him who he was. The sword did not steal these things against his will. He gave them up willingly, eagerly, in exchange for the power he craved. That is the true horror of Frostmourne's seduction. It did not force Arthas to become a monster. It simply offered him the power to become what he already wanted to be, and he accepted the bargain with open eyes. The same pattern repeats throughout history. Those who seek power through forbidden means often find that the price is higher than they ever imagined, yet they pay it willingly because they cannot imagine a world where they are powerless. For the jailer, the Lich King was merely a tool, a means to an end rather than an end in itself. This reveals another truth about the nature of evil. Those who believe they are masters are often servants of forces they do not understand. Ner'zhul thought he was escaping the Legion's control when he fled through his portal. Instead, he was delivering himself into the hands of a power that made the Legion seem merciful by comparison. Arthas believed he was saving his people when he took up Frostmourne. In truth, he was becoming the instrument of their destruction, harvesting their souls for a cosmic predator who lurked beyond the veil of death. The Lich King's story teaches us that there is no such thing as evil in isolation. Every villain is connected to forces larger than themselves, whether they know it or not. The demons serve Sargeras, who believes he serves order through destruction. The Scourge served the Lich King, who served the Legion, who unknowingly served the jailer. The chains of causation and manipulation stretch back beyond history, beyond memory, to the very foundations of the cosmos. We act in the belief that we are free, but we are all dancing to music we cannot hear. The destruction of the Helm of Domination marked the end of the Lich King's era. There will be no fourth bearer of the Helm, no new master of the Scourge. The Helm itself no longer exists in its original form, reforged into the Crown of Wills by the Primus of Maldraxxus. The undead that remain on Azeroth are gradually being destroyed or contained, their threat diminishing with each passing year. Organized efforts by the Argent Crusade and other groups continue to cleanse the Plague Lands, to destroy the remaining undead, to heal the wounds that the Scourge left upon the land. The Frozen Throne stands empty, a monument to past horrors rather than a seat of present power. Yet the memory of the Lich King lingers, as it must. Parents tell their children stories of the Death Knight who murdered his father, the king who became a monster, the prince who fell into darkness. These are not mere tales of horror, but cautionary stories, warnings about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the seductive nature of power. Warriors train against the tactics the Scourge employed, learning to fight enemies who feel no pain and know no fear, ensuring they will be ready if such an enemy ever rises again. Scholars study the plague that created the Scourge, seeking to understand how it worked so that it can never be replicated. The world remembers because it must, because forgetting invites repetition, because the price of ignorance is paid in blood. Now, as you drift toward sleep, let the weight of this epic tale settle over you like a blanket of snow. The Lich King's story is one of tragedy and horror, but it is also a story of courage and sacrifice. For every villain who rose to threaten the world, there were heroes who stood against them. For every death that fed the Scourge's ranks, there were survivors who refused to give in to despair. The heroes who stood against the darkness, who refused to surrender even when all seemed lost, they are the true legacy of this age. Think of Tyrion Fordring, the disgraced paladin who found redemption in the most unlikely of circumstances. Cast out from the Silver Hand for defending an orc, he spent years in exile, questioning everything he believed. But when the moment came, when the Lich King seemed invincible and all hope was lost, Tyrion called upon the light, and the light answered. His faith, tested and tempered by years of hardship, proved stronger than any weapon Arthas could wield. Think of the nameless soldiers who fought in Northrend, who knew they might fall and rise as enemies, yet fought anyway. They had families waiting for them, lives they wanted to return to, futures they hoped to see. But they marched into the frozen north because someone had to, because the alternative was to let the Scourge consume everything they loved. Their names are not recorded in the great histories, but their sacrifice made victory possible. Think of Bolvar Fordragon, who sat in darkness for years so that others might live in light. He asked for nothing, expected no reward, simply did what needed to be done because he could and no one else could do it better. His sacrifice was not a single moment of heroism, but an eternity of suffering, endured willingly so that the world could go on. Consider the journey we have taken together. We began in the Shadowlands, where the jailer forged his instruments of domination in the heart of Torghast. We witnessed the Primus, stripped of memory and identity, forced to create the very tools that would bring such suffering to the mortal world. We followed Ner'zhul from respected shaman to tortured spirit to cosmic horror, watching as Kil'jaeden's vengeance transformed a once good soul into something that could never be redeemed. We watched Arthas fall from noble prince to Death Knight to something beyond human understanding, each step down that dark path seeming reasonable in the moment, but leading inevitably to damnation. We saw Bolvar take up an impossible burden and carry it for years beyond counting, his spirit unbroken even as his body was ruined. Each of these figures made choices that shaped the course of history. Their decisions, for good or ill, determined the fate of millions. Ner'zhul chose to trust a false spirit, and that choice doomed his people. Arthas chose to pursue vengeance over wisdom, and that choice doomed his kingdom. Bolvar chose to sacrifice his own future to protect others, and that choice saved the world. We are all the products of our choices, the sum of every decision we have ever made. The story of the Lich King reminds us that those choices matter, that the paths we walk lead somewhere, whether to glory or damnation. The frozen throne sits empty now, covered in snow that will never melt. The citadel around it crumbles slowly, ice and stone returning to the earth from which they came. Wind howls through empty halls that once echoed with the sounds of suffering. The undead that once patrolled those corridors have been destroyed or have wandered away, their binding purpose gone forever. In time, perhaps even the memory of the Lich King will fade, becoming legend and then myth and then nothing at all. But that time is not yet come, for now the story lives on, passed from voice to ear, from memory to memory, from generation to generation. It lives in the scars on the land, in the twisted trees of the plague lands, and the haunted ruins of Lordaeron. It lives in the trauma of the survivors, in the nightmares that still wake veterans of the Northrend campaign, in the empty chairs at family tables where loved ones should have sat. It lives in the lessons learned and the warnings heeded, in the vigilance that prevents new horrors from arising. The Lich King is gone, but his shadow stretches long across the world, a reminder of how close everything came to ending. Let your breathing slow as the tale concludes. Feel the tension leave your body, the weight of the narrative settling into something comfortable and warm. The darkness has passed, the heroes have triumphed, and the world endures as it has always endured. Whatever nightmares the Lich King may have inspired, they hold no power over you now. You are safe in the warmth of the present, removed from the frozen horrors of Northrend by time and space, and the simple fact of your existence. The ice cannot touch you here, the cold cannot reach you. The Scourge is a story now, a tale told to explain why the world is the way it is. The Scourge no longer marches. The armies of the dead rest in their graves, undisturbed and undisturbing. The frozen throne stands empty, a monument rather than a seat of power. Frostmourne is shattered, its fragments scattered, the souls it consumed finally freed to find whatever peace awaits them. And somewhere in the Shadowlands, beyond the veil that separates the living from the dead, the machinery of death has been restored. Souls once again flow to their proper destinations, judged and sorted as they were always meant to be. The damage done by the Lich King's existence is slowly being healed. The story has ended, and a new chapter begins, one that has nothing to do with death and everything to do with life. The sun rises over Azeroth, warming lands that were once frozen, illuminating corners that were once dark. Children are born who will never know the terror of the Scourge, who will hear the Lich King's name only in stories told by grandparents. The world heals as it always heals, and life goes on. Sleep now, and let the tale of the Lich King guide you into dreams. Perhaps you will walk the frozen halls of Icecrown Citadel, not as a warrior, but as a visitor, exploring the ruins of a fallen empire with the curiosity of a historian rather than the fear of a soldier. Perhaps you will meet the spirits of those who fell in battle, hear their stories, and carry their memories forward into a world they gave their lives to protect. Perhaps you will stand upon the frozen throne itself, feeling the cold wind against your face, and understand at last why Bolvar's sacrifice was necessary. Perhaps you will simply rest, free from the weight of history, content in the knowledge that even the darkest night eventually gives way to dawn. The Lich King's story has ended. The tale has been told. The heroes have won their victory, and the villains have met their fates. But your story continues, unwritten and full of possibility. Whatever choices lie before you, whatever paths you might walk, remember the lessons of this tale. Remember that power without wisdom is destruction. Remember that good intentions can lead to terrible ends. Remember that sacrifice and courage can triumph over the darkest evil. Rest well, and may your dreams be free of frost and shadow. May you wake refreshed, renewed, ready to face whatever challenges await you. And may you always remember that even in the coldest winter, spring eventually returns. The world of Azeroth has seen many threats since the fall of the Lich King. Dragons have risen and fallen. Ancient evils have awakened from slumber. The Burning Legion launched its final desperate assault. The wounds left by cosmic forces have scarred the land and sea. Yet through it all, the people of Azeroth have persevered, have fought back, have refused to surrender to despair. They learned important lessons from the war against the Scourge, lessons that have served them well in every crisis that followed. They learned that unity is strength, that old enemies can become allies when the stakes are high enough. The Alliance and Horde fought side by side against the Lich King, setting aside generations of hatred to face a common foe. That lesson has been tested and relearned many times since, as new threats have forced old enemies to cooperate once more. They learned that sacrifice is sometimes necessary, that some burdens must be borne so that others may live free. Bolvar's choice to take up the Helm of Domination was not unique in Azeroth's history. Others have made similar sacrifices, have given their futures so that the world could have one. They learned that redemption is possible, that even those who have fallen can find their way back to the light. Sylvanas Windrunner, who served the jailer and committed terrible crimes, eventually came to understand the wrong she had done and worked to make amends. Her redemption is not complete, may never be complete, but she took the first steps on that long road, and they learned that some victories come at great cost, that winning does not mean escaping unscathed. The war against the Lich King claimed millions of lives and destroyed kingdoms that had stood for centuries. That price can never be undone. But paying that price meant that the world survived, that future generations would have the chance to build something better on the foundations the survivors laid down. These are the lessons of the Lich King, the wisdom that comes from remembering his story. They are lessons worth keeping, worth passing on, worth remembering in the quiet moments before sleep claims you. They are the legacy of all who suffered and all who sacrificed, the gift that the dead have given to the living. In the end, the Lich King's story is a human story, despite involving orcs and elves, demons and cosmic entities. It is a story about the choices we make and the consequences of those choices. It is a story about power and corruption, about love and loss, about the darkness that lurks in even the brightest hearts. It is a story that has been told in different forms throughout human history, because these themes are eternal, because they speak to something fundamental about who we are and who we might become. The Lich King is gone now, truly gone, his era ended and his throne empty. But the story remains, and the story is what matters. The story teaches us, the story warns us, the story helps us understand ourselves and the world we live in. And if we are wise, if we have learned the lessons that the story offers, then perhaps we can avoid the mistakes that Ner'zhul and Arthas made. Perhaps we can choose differently, choose better, choose paths that lead to light rather than darkness. That is the true power of stories. They allow us to learn from the mistakes of others, even fictional others, without having to make those mistakes ourselves. They show us the consequences of choices we have not yet made, give us the wisdom of experience we have not yet earned, and in that way, they make us better, stronger, wiser than we would have been without them. If you enjoyed this journey through the complete story of the Lich King, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us create more content exploring the rich and wonderful lore of Azeroth. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on the Lich King's legacy, on the choices Arthas made, or on the cosmic implications of the jailer's schemes. Did you find Arthas's fall tragic or inevitable? Do you believe there was any way to save him? What do you think of Bolvar's sacrifice and Sylvanas' role in ending his watch? Whatever your thoughts, we would love to hear them. Thank you for spending this peaceful time with us here at World of Sleepcraft. We hope this tale of ice and shadow, of heroes and villains, of sacrifice and redemption has given you something to contemplate as you drift toward sleep. The lore of Azeroth is vast and deep, filled with stories that can transport us to other worlds and other times. We are honored to be your guides through these tales, and we look forward to sharing more adventures with you in the future. Until next time, rest well, sleep deeply, and may all of your dreams be filled with wonder and lasting peace. May you wake to a world that is a little brighter than the one you left, a world that remembers the lessons of the past while looking toward the future with hope. Good night, and may the light protect you always.